the silence between calls. At the exact moment that Miss Edna Pike placed the receiver back upon its cradle, Great Minden's telephone exchange ceased, very politely, to function. She noted this, as she noted most things, without excitement. There was a short, thoughtful silence in the switchboard, a sort of pause which suggested that even the wires were considering the matter. The green indicator lamps, usually so brisk in their glow, flickered as if uncertain whether they still had responsibilities. Miss Pike sniffed. Not loudly, certainly, but with a dignity which suggested mild disappointment in the modern world. "That will not do at all," she murmured to herself. The afternoon itself, it must be said, was perfectly ordinary. The small market town of Great Minden had nothing particular planned. The post office smelled gently of string and damp newsprint. A bus coughed its way along Bell Street. Councillor Harrowby, returning from a committee that had failed to agree upon almost anything, purchased 2 ounces of humbugs and reflected that retirement was a rum business. The exchange occupied a modest red brick building near the cooperative bakery, close enough that the operators acquired a faintly sweet aroma, entirely without intention. The room was warm with valves and habit. The furniture was polished with that quiet devotion which exists when one has polished the same desk since 1932. Miss Pike tried one of the external lines. Nothing. She tried another. Less than nothing, which in exchange terminology meant something that would require a form to be filled. Behind her, the wall clock, which had always been too fast, now appeared to lose confidence and ticked with a less certain spirit. It was at that exact point that she noticed the letter. This was, in ordinary circumstances, impossible. One does not fail to notice envelopes lying upon one's switchboard. A switchboard, by its nature, attracts no envelopes. Wires, perhaps, folders occasionally, cups of tea, regrettably. But letters? No. And yet there it lay, a pale cream envelope, resting quietly beside the socket labelled Rectory. No stamp, no typed address, only, in a firm but modest hand, for the attention of the exchange. It was not part of the post. It had not fluttered in. There were no open windows. Miss Pike's mind, which tended toward moral rather than imaginative explanations, found this objectionable. She lifted it. It felt heavier than a simple folded note should feel. The lamps flickered. The clock observed her. She hesitated before opening it. Not from fear. Miss Pike did not experience fear in the usual sense, but from a belief that certain things properly belonged to certain people, and she was not, strictly speaking, meant to be a person included in certain things. At that moment, the bell above the exchange door gave its small, apologetic clatter. Mrs. Amabel Joss entered. Mrs. Joss was the chairman of more committees than anyone quite remembered, and of the general opinion that telephones were only trustworthy when supervised. "Oh, Edna," she said, removing a hat which had always appeared surprised. "Everything's gone peculiar. The chemist cannot ring the butcher. The butcher's summoned the town clerk directly. And the town clerk, I regret to say, is ringing my house from a kiosk behind the station." Miss Pike, who regarded disorder as a personal affront, held up the envelope without speaking. Mrs. Joss saw it. Mrs. Joss did not ask how it had arrived. Mrs. Joss attached rather more importance to envelopes than to machinery. "Open it," she said. "I don't believe it belongs to me," said Miss Pike, which was her strongest possible objection. But she slit it open with her paper knife, which had never yet failed her. Inside were not words, but something far more unsettling. A small, matte black square of card. No message, no signature. Only one thing written in the same careful hand. "Stop asking who listens." They stared at it. The green lamps died altogether. Somewhere in the network of wires that tied Great Minden to the rest of England, a very faint, very deliberate click was heard, and then nothing more. Mrs. Joss whispered, quite without political skill, "This will be in the papers." Miss Pike replaced the card in the envelope, squared it upon the desk, and looked, for the first time in 20 years, genuinely thoughtful. Out in the town, Councillor Harrowby bit into a humbug and found it had no flavour. And at his desk, 3 streets away, a man who had not yet been troubled by any of this, Inspector Purbright, paused in the act of lifting his pen because he had the interesting sensation that something somewhere was not being said to him, and the telephone did not ring. Well-meaning speculations. By 4:30, the telephone exchange of Great Minden had become a building of theory. The machines themselves remained mute, which only encouraged the human alternatives. If wires would not speak, people clearly must. Miss Pike, having returned the card to its envelope and the envelope to a drawer that had not previously contained mystery, found that the room had acquired a faint air of visitation. It was not full of people. That would have been vulgar, but it was full of expectation. Mrs. Joss had positioned herself on the visitor's chair as if she had been elected to it. "I don't care what the post office says," she remarked, to no one in particular, but with the conviction of someone accustomed to chairing meetings that adjourned without agreement. "It isn't natural for a whole town to go silent at once." Miss Pike arranged her plugs with some care, though none of them responded. "I should not like to say what is natural, Mrs. Joss," she said. "The weather is natural, brass fittings are natural, this is merely unusual." Outside, the town had begun. At Claythorpe's grocer's, Mrs. Millicent Claythorpe was explaining for the 3rd time in 6 minutes that she had always suspected the new cables laid along Station Road. She was a woman who had once distrusted margarine for a decade and felt her record should be respected. Mrs. Potts, who had come in for a 1/4 pound of butter she would not enjoy, listened with the satisfaction of someone receiving material for private circulation. "Well, I don't say it's foreign," said Mrs. Potts, which is to say, she was saying it was. At the ironmonger's, Mr. Dallow, who enjoyed machinery only when it did not interfere, explained to 2 labourers that modern communications were unreliable precisely because they were not based on solid, visible effort. One of the labourers, who had never trusted visibility, nodded. At the railway buffet, which enjoyed a daily crop of low-level theories, it was established that the telephones were not broken at all, but being tested. By whom remained enticingly unclear. All of this reached the police station not as information but as a surge of atmosphere. Inspector Purbright's room was, as always, a neutral environment. It did not approve nor disapprove of events. It simply awaited them. The blotter was clean, the pen honest, the small electric fire faintly optimistic. The first report arrived by foot, carried by Constable Druitt, whose regulation stride acquired a philosophical quality when matters were uncertain. "Bit of bother at the exchange, sir," he said. "So I understand," said Purbright mildly, though he did not. "They say it's gone quiet, all of it. And there was a thing, perhaps, a sort of note." "Perhaps," said Purbright. He wrote nothing down. 5 minutes later, Sergeant Bligh arrived in person, having cycled with more than usual commitment. "Mysterious, sir," he said. "People are unsettled." "Yes," said Purbright, and this time he tipped his pen slightly, but not to paper. When at last the envelope itself arrived, conveyed with great respect by Mrs. Joss, who believed strongly in delivering documents personally, the room's atmosphere adjusted again. Documents, however small, caused a polite shift in the air. Purbright examined it without opening it. He noted the paper, the handwriting, the quiet stubbornness of the phrase. "May I?" Mrs. Joss asked. "I think we both already have," he said gently. The card inside was revealed to him. He did not react in any official way. There was no theatrical weight given, no tightening of jaw, no movement of chair. He merely read, "Stop asking who listens." Mrs. Joss waited for judgment. She was used to judgments being pronounced across tables. "This seems," said Purbright, "to be both a request and a complaint." He closed the envelope. Outside, the telephones remained obstinate. Inside houses, their mute presence began to acquire personality. Mrs. Claythorpe lifted and replaced her receiver several times, each with a slightly different expression of moral concern. The Reverend Slade attempted to ring the bishop's office, failed, and experienced a brief but genuine theological confusion. At Miss Carrow's dress shop, a customer whispered, "They say the lines have been watched for months," which Miss Carrow received with the sympathetic gravity usually reserved for sudden illnesses. It was in the early evening that the first unlikely conclusion was born. Mr. Trevor Nim, recently dismissed from a junior post at the post office for what was officially termed irregularities of attention, found himself in demand. He had been seen only 2 days prior, hanging around the exchange in a manner which could now be described with hindsight as suggestive. "He's always been the sort," said Mrs. Potts, though what sort had never been established. By 8 o'clock, everyone knows it's that young fellow, had acquired the reassuring quality of fact. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, walked. Great Minden was at its most truthful in the uncertain hour before darkness arrived. The greengrocer closed with a muted defiance. The butcher wiped his block with the slight resentment of a man whose profession had not been consulted. Curtains were drawn with gentle curiosity. Outside the exchange, Purbright paused. He did not go in. He looked instead at the door, the bricks, the small step, polished by decades of decent shoes. He noted a scuff mark, recent. It meant nothing. He noted that someone had attempted to tidy it and failed. That meant rather more. Inside, Miss Pike had arranged the drawer. She had placed the envelope at the front, as if it were a matter of routine which should not be ignored. She had told no one else about the weight of it. She did not like making a fuss. The clock had regained confidence. The lamps remained dark. That evening, as Great Minden consumed its tea and discussed the unpleasantness of unreliable systems, a thought moved gently from house to house that perhaps someone had been listening longer than anyone had politely noticed. At his desk, Purbright finally wrote a line. It was not about the message. It was not about Trevor Nim. It simply said, "Visit exchange in the morning. Observe before inquiring." And in the wires above the sleeping town, which would not yet carry voices, there was another small, deliberate click, as if someone had rehearsed the sound of silence and found it satisfactory. That pleasant afternoon question. Inspector Purbright arrived at the telephone exchange at 10 minutes past 9, which he considered a humane time for truth to be encountered. The lamps were still out. The door was open, but only in the way of a door that would rather not advertise the fact. Miss Pike, who regarded punctuality as a form of structural support, was in her chair, hands folded, prepared for the day to behave itself. She rose with care. "Good morning, Inspector." "Good morning, Miss Pike." He removed his hat with the sort of dual-purpose politeness that served both conversation and environment. He did not look immediately at the switchboard. That, he felt, would be unseemly. "I thought I might call in," he said, "purely to observe how official duties progress in altered circumstances." "They are not progressing," said Miss Pike promptly. "They are waiting." He smiled faintly at this. Waiting, he knew, was where most truths began. He glanced at the sockets without appearing to glance at the sockets. He noted the careful order, the finger marks of daily routine, the small areas where polish had been removed by repeated, honest touch. The absence of light gave the room an air of rehearsal. Mrs. Joss, who had been lingering in the corridor with the unmistakable patience of an elected person, entered without flowing. "I thought you'd come," she said to Purbright, with satisfaction, that preempted causation. "I find it useful," he replied, "to see work that isn't being done." Mrs. Joss nodded. She found this agreeable and not likely to appear in the minutes. Miss Pike produced the envelope without drama. This was important. Drama spoiled surfaces. Purbright held it between two fingers, turning it in a manner that implied apology to the paper. "May I ask when you first noticed it?" he inquired. Miss Pike considered. "After the first of the nothing," she said. "And before any of the people?" "Before Mrs. Joss," said Miss Pike, which was tactful. Mrs. Joss coughed. "And did you hear anything?" Purbright asked. "Only the clock," said Miss Pike. "It changed its tone slightly." Purbright looked at the clock. It had resumed confidence but retained perhaps a trace of regret. He opened the envelope again. The black card was unchanged. It had the quiet defiance of a small object out of place. "Have you asked who listens?" he asked, mildly, as if discussing weather. Miss Pike tightened. "No, Inspector," she said. "I would not find that delicate." Mrs. Joss said nothing, which was worse. He nodded, replaced the card, and did not yet pocket it. "I'd like," he said, "to ask a few polite questions if that would not distress the routine." "Routine is already distressed," Mrs. Joss informed him, helpfully. He began with matters that were not on the surface, central. He asked Miss Pike when the lamps had last been cleaned. He asked how often the back door was used. He asked which of the drawers tended to stick. He asked whether the biscuits had been fresher before or after the war. Miss Pike answered all of these with an efficiency that made the exchange sound like a chapel. Then he walked, by himself, through the small back room. There was nothing of note. This was of note. The scuff mark on the step remained. It had been rubbed again by a diligent foot with poor judgment. Outside, Great Minden was behaving as though it were being observed by itself. Mrs. Claythorpe greeted Purbright as he passed her shop, with the smile of a woman preparing to be factual. "They say it's that Nim boy," she murmured. "So I hear," said Purbright. "He was always peering." "Many people peer," Purbright agreed. "They've given him the look at the post office." "That must have been severe?" Mrs. Claythorpe leaned closer. "And they say it's something to do with numbers," she added, which introduced mystery without explanation. At the bakery, Mr. Sims, flouring a tray, informed no one in particular that wires were never meant to be trusted because they ran underground. This was received by the bread with silent respect. Purbright continued, unhurried, as though the morning itself were something that could be folded up neatly later. He called, not officially, at the police station. Trevor Nim was already known there in the abstract. Sergeant Bligh was eager. "He's got that look," Bligh said. "What look?" "The sort of look," Bligh explained. "That looks." Purbright nodded. He did not ask to see Nim. He did not mention the card. Instead, he asked who had keys to the exchange. "Oh, a fair few," said Bligh. "Miss Pike, a spare with Mrs. Joss, one at the council offices, and the old emergency one in the phone box by the church." "The locked one?" Purbright asked. "The locked one," Bligh confirmed. That, Purbright thought, was an answer that would be useful later. He walked to the church kiosk. It was untouched but not unloved. Someone had wiped the shelf recently but missed a corner. There was a faint mark inside, as though paper had rested there for a thoughtful while. He did not linger. By late afternoon the lamps had flickered once, faintly, then returned to their refusal. By early evening it was widely agreed that something was being concealed. By nightfall the story had adjusted itself. Trevor Nim had become a man of method. The card had become a warning. The exchange had become a centre of plots. Miss Pike poured herself tea she did not drink. Mrs. Joss drafted a statement that would not be used. In his room, Purbright sat. He did not look again at the message. He looked at the scuff mark in his memory and the wiped corner in the kiosk and the tone of the clock. There was a pattern, but it was not yet a picture. And for the second night in succession, when he lifted the receiver at his own desk, he heard only the sound of a town holding its breath and something very faint beneath it, like paper being moved carefully in the dark. A convenient scapegoat. By the third morning, Great Minden had achieved a condition of moral certainty. The wires remained uncooperative, but the town's sense of justice had become finely tuned. It is a comfort, when machinery is silent, to allow opinion to hum more loudly in its place. Trevor Nim, who had not done anything visible since misplacing a registered parcel in February, now possessed a reputation of almost industrial complexity. Inspector Purbright observed this development without enthusiasm and without interruption. At the market square, he paused near the flower stall where Miss Lavinia Grout was arranging chrysanthemums with the severity of a woman who had once served on a library committee. She leaned towards him with the weight of private civic duty. "It's a mercy, in a way," she said. "I'm very glad to hear it," said Purbright. "We've all felt uneasy about that boy for some time, lurking, hanging about, listening too closely." "Did he ever listen to you?" Purbright asked. Miss Grout stiffened. "I don't recall having been listened to improperly," she said. From the butcher's doorway, Mr. Haynes joined in with the cautious boldness of a man whose hands were always occupied by respectable objects. "They found him near the exchange once," he said. "When was that?" asked Purbright. "Oh, before all this," said Haynes, "or perhaps after. It's difficult to recall since everything started. The official matter became official shortly after noon. Sergeant Bligh, whose sense of useful progress required a visible line to be drawn under things, arrived with a face that suggested achievement. "We've brought him in," he said. "That's economical," said Purbright. Trevor Nim sat in a chair that had been used by men with larger crimes and smaller fates. He was thin in the face and very deliberate in the way of not meeting anyone's eyes. He smelled faintly of cheap soap and oranges. "I don't know anything about it," he said before being asked. "Of course," said Purbright. Sergeant Bligh leaned forward. "Tell him what we found," he said, as if this were a ceremony. They produced a folded scrap of dark paper from an evidence envelope, cracked at the edges and smudged by human seriousness. "It was in his room," said Bligh. Trevor's eyes flickered. "It's just paper," he said. "Is it?" asked Purbright gently. The paper bore a faint resemblance to the black card, though it had no words. It was merely black and small and quietly defensible as coincidence. "Where did you obtain this?" Purbright asked. "It came round something I posted," Trevor said. "It was inside a thing that arrived broken. I kept it because it felt unusual." Bligh snorted. "Unusual," he repeated. "But you didn't write on it," Purbright said. "No," said Trevor, "and you didn't put it in the exchange." "I've never been inside, except when my mother had to ring the doctor in '54. That, strictly speaking, was possible." Purbright nodded, thanked him, and left him in the care of men who preferred certainty to shape. Outside, the town entered a phase of justified satisfaction. "Always the quiet ones," said Mrs. Potts, who had once lost a teaspoon without recovery. Mrs. Claythorpe wrapped cheese with the confidence of a woman assisting destiny. "It'll all come out proper now," she said. At the exchange, Miss Pike heard the news in the specific tone reserved for unpleasant surprises that were somehow expected. She did not remark upon it. She arranged her plugs. She corrected a misaligned drawer that had not moved. Mrs. Joss arrived with a copy of a letter, already drafted. "I knew it would be someone like him," she said. "There's a look." "The look of what?" asked Miss Pike, without accusation. Mrs. Joss hesitated. "The look of being separate." That afternoon, Purbright walked, which he did most afternoons regardless of trouble, but with a professional quality of watching rather than travelling. He heard the story develop in the air. Nim had been lurking at night. Nim had been listening to calls. Nim had been cleverer than he looked. None of this was witnessed, but all of it was sincerely felt. He paused at the church kiosk again. The faint mark on the shelf remained. Someone had added powder to conceal it, and failed. The keyhole bore a fresh polish from an anxious hand. Purbright touched nothing. He allowed things to be as they were. At the station, Sergeant Bligh received him with relief. "He didn't resist," Bligh said. "That's always a sign." "Sometimes of obedience," said Purbright. Bligh frowned. "But we've got something now," he said. "Paper in his room, hanging about? Prior history?" "It is very orderly," said Purbright. By evening the lamps at the exchange flickered twice. The wires, which had been silent out of spite or propriety, seemed to consider cooperation. They did not commit. In her small parlour, Mrs. Claythorpe told a neighbour that she had always felt it. In his narrow room, Trevor Nim sat on his bed and tried to remember what it was he was supposed to have done. In the quiet streets, the town felt reassured by the shape of a person who could be held responsible. Inspector Purbright sat at his desk and sorted through nothing. He did not write about the paper. He did not write about Trevor. He wrote only that the scuff mark had been rubbed again, and that this was the action of someone who wanted to remove attention rather than attract it. The official conclusion was in motion, like a tram requiring no steering. Purbright lifted his receiver. For the first time there was a faint hum, not a voice, not a call, just the suggestion that lines were capable of carrying things again. He replaced it slowly, with the sense of a man who had been offered the wrong solution to a correct question. And in the telephone exchange, unseen and unremarked, a drawer shifted slightly of its own accord and settled back in place as if disturbed by someone who preferred not to exist at all. The matter of the unsent envelope. The following morning arrived with the steady confidence of a day that did not yet know it would be complicated. At the telephone exchange, the lamps returned with a modest reluctance, glowing faintly as if participating under protest. The wires, too, resumed their duties, but without warmth. Conversations moved through them in a thin, cautious manner, like visitors who did not remove their coats. Miss Pike adjusted the cords in the careful silence of someone who did not speak to machines unless necessary. She was aware that things had not returned to normal. They had merely adopted a version of it which required supervision. The drawer, whose movement of the previous evening had not been recorded, was exactly as it had been left. Almost. There was a faint overlap in the papers, a corner where a rectangle of dust no longer quite matched its previous discipline. Miss Pike noticed this, as she noticed most things, not with alarm, but with disapproval. Inside the drawer lay something that had not earned the right to be there. A second envelope. This one was thinner. This one was not addressed at all. It was simply blank, resting among the official forms like a guest who had slipped into the wrong funeral. She lifted it. It was light, lighter than the first. Empty, perhaps, or only pretending to be. She did not open it. Instead, she set it upon the edge of the desk where it could be watched. Outside, Great Minden began its daily adjustments. At Claythorpe's, Mrs. Claythorpe informed Mrs. Potts that young Nim had not slept a wink in the cells, which was untrue but satisfying. "They found more paper," said Mrs. Potts. "What sort?" asked Mrs. Claythorpe. "Dark," said Mrs. Potts, which covered nearly everything. The exchange rang with proper work now. The butcher rang the baker rang the chemist, and the chemist rang nobody at all, being in conference with his conscience. The lines worked, but they felt watched. This was not a technical matter. Inspector Purbright entered without ceremony. He noticed the envelope before Miss Pike told him. He noticed the way the air behaved around it, and the way Miss Pike's posture had altered. "Another?" he said. "Yes," she said. "And you did not summon it?" "No." He held it between his fingers. It had no texture of threat. It was merely present, which was worse. "May I open it?" he asked. "Please," she said. Inside was nothing, nothing at all. He tipped it gently, as one might encourage the last crumb of sugar from a trusted basin. Nothing family of nothing moved, but something had been there, that much was clear. The inside carried the faintest impression of folded shape, long stored. "What is not here," he said mildly, "has more character than what is." Miss Pike thought this over. Mrs. Joss arrived mid-morning with a briskness that suggested the wheels of authority had found lubrication. "They've told me he'll be sent along by Friday," she said. "Who?" asked Purbright. "That Nim boy. District men want to look at him." "How thorough," said Purbright. There was a faint smell of biscuit in the air, though no biscuits were visible. "What is new?" asked Mrs. Joss, seeing the envelope. "Nothing," said Purbright. She looked disappointed. "That is more serious than it sounds," he added kindly. That afternoon he sat with the envelope on his own desk. He held it to the window. Light passed through without hesitation, but the air inside resisted it, as if remembering shape. He tried a thought. He folded it. A faint line appeared where the fold would naturally occur, as if guided by memory. This pleased him, not at all. He walked. At the post office, the clerk was most cooperative with help that was not asked. "We never touch exchange mail," she said. "I didn't suppose you did." "And we don't let anyone see unsigned envelopes." "I should hope not. But sometimes," she added. "Yes." "Well, sometimes things sit too long in sorting." "How long?" "Long enough to grow ideas." He nodded. At the church kiosk he found the shelf clean. Too clean. The earlier carelessness had been erased by someone who knew that erasing was noticeable and was attempting not to be noticeable. There was a smell, faint, of damp paper. He did not touch the lock. Back at the station, Trevor Nim sat with his hands folded like a boy in the wrong lesson. "Did you ever see this?" Purbright asked, showing him the blank envelope. Trevor shook his head. "No." "Have you ever posted a letter without knowing what was inside?" Trevor frowned. "No, sir." "That is good," said Purbright. "And would you ever take the contents out and leave the shell?" he asked. Trevor's eyes lifted. "Why would anyone do that?" Purbright looked at him. "That is precisely my difficulty," he said. By late afternoon, Miss Pike had placed the envelope inside the drawer, then removed it again, then placed it back. She did not like its silence. By early evening, a faint rumour travelled that something had been taken from the exchange. No one knew what, which allowed them to know everything. At the market square, someone said, "It's not what's there, it's what's missing," and felt wise. Inspector Purbright returned to his room. He placed the envelope beside the black card. 2 shapes, one filled, one void, one commanding silence, one practicing it. He wrote nothing. He held his pen and thought about how often people noticed what lay upon desks and how rarely they noticed what had left them. Outside, the lamps of the exchange burned more steadily. Inside, the wires carried voices without complaint. But in the quiet places, in drawers, in kiosks, in the corners of rooms that had been wiped too carefully, the absence of something no one could name began to feel deliberate. And for the first time since the first interruption, Purbright felt that the thing being done was quieter, cleverer, and much nearer to him than anyone had yet suspected. Every respectable door is closed softly. The 6th day began with a kind of municipal fatigue. Great Minden had grown tired of being extraordinary. It had exhausted its more energetic theories and now entered a phase of gentler suspicion, the sort that sat quietly in parlours and travelled in lowered voices. The exchange worked. This was considered bad form. It removed a visible enemy and left only manners, memory, and implication. At 9 o'clock, Miss Pike unlocked the door and found the air unchanged from the night before. This disappointed her. Air, she felt, should not be so independent. She checked the drawer. Nothing moved. Nothing sat wrongly. This, too, was disappointing. The blank envelope and the black card remained on Purbright's desk at the station, set beside one another with the civility of objects that did not acknowledge kinship. He regarded them with the faint disappointment he often reserved for people who had something to say, and chose better words. Instead of examining them further, he went out. He began at the less noticed edges of the town, the dry cleaners where fabric waited upon memory, the tobacconists where silence was sold in small, polite squares, the charity shop where unwanted intentions lay folded and priced. It was here he met Miss Clara Bonham, who ran the shop with an expression that suggested she approved of poverty only when it had been neatly laundered. "We don't get much that comes through the exchange," she said, unbidden. "I wouldn't suppose you would," he replied. "I did notice," she said, adjusting a rack of coats which remembered different shoulders, "that Mrs. Joss has been in 3 times this week." "Looking for garments?" he asked. "For paper," said Miss Bonham. "There is no sound, in nature, so loud as a quiet piece of gossip being handed to a polite man." Later, at the baker's, Mrs. Sims maintained that she had seen a stranger near the telephone kiosk on 2 occasions. This stranger proved on examination to be a man who had been in the town for 20 years and had merely decided to grow a moustache out of season. Even so, it was considered notable. Inspector Purbright returned to the exchange without signifying his arrival. He watched. Miss Pike touched the plugs without thinking. Mrs. Joss arrived without stating her cause. The drawer remained closed. He walked without comment towards the back door. It was shut. This pleased him. Shutting implied intention. Locking was another matter. "Do you ever go out this way?" he asked Miss Pike. "Never," she said. "Does anyone?" "No." "This is very reassuring," he said. He opened the door. The yard was small, respectable, and entirely without imagination. The bins stood in their place as if awaiting inspection by history. The fence had been mended twice, which was always a sign of long-standing discontent, with small gaps. On the ground near the step lay nothing visible. But the earth was slightly different. Someone had stood there. Someone had waited. Someone had been careful. Back inside, Miss Pike poured tea that tasted of watchfulness. "You do not think it was the boy?" she asked. "I think he has a face that encourages comfort," said Purbright. "And that is wrong?" "It is convenient," he said. At the council offices, Councillor Harrowby was explaining to no one in particular that order had been restored. "Just a bit of foolishness," he said. "Young fellows, paper, listening." "Listening to whom?" asked Purbright. "Well," said Harrowby, and retreated behind T. It was in the corridor outside the main office that Purbright noticed the thing that mattered. A small notice pinned to the board announcing a change of locks to certain municipal facilities dated 2 weeks earlier. Below it, a neat initial. A.J. Mrs. Joss. It did not prove anything. It did not explain anything. It merely sat. In the afternoon, Sergeant Bligh became restless. "We could charge him," he said. "Make it all sit proper." "You often sit very well," said Purbright. At 4, Mrs. Joss entered the exchange again. She said she had come to check on civic morale. She did not look at the drawer. She did look at the back door. Miss Pike did not notice. She did not like watching. By evening, Great Minden had adopted a newer, quieter version of the story. Perhaps it had not been a young man. Perhaps it had been someone respectable. This was said in a way that covered both accusation and excuse. Respectability, once bruised, becomes a thing easily suspected. In a parlour near the Green, a man named Arthur Pell, who had once lost a council seat over the matter of a borrowed garden chair, sat alone and read nothing. He did not like the way things had turned. He had no part in it, but felt the need to adjust his curtains. At twilight, Purbright stood by the kiosk. He did not open it. He did not touch it. He simply observed that it had been oiled. Someone had cared for the lock, not for entry, but for ease. This mattered. Back at his desk, the inspector placed the blank envelope atop the black card. They did not align perfectly. This displeased him. He thought of the notice, of the back door, of the light earth, of the drawer that preferred to remain unfaithful. The field was larger now, not in obvious size, but in shape. It had moved from small hands and nervous habits to committees and keys and quiet responsibilities, from young faces and quick conclusions to careful women and polished locks, and somewhere, not yet visible, but now undeniably present, was the sort of mind that did not steal things to possess them, but to remove them. That night, Miss Pike locked the exchange. She stood a moment longer at the back door than usual. She felt oddly observed by a yard that had never before interested her. She turned the key. It turned easily. Too easily. And somewhere in the town, behind a door that would always be gently closed, a respectable person sat with a collection of things that no longer officially existed and tried very hard to appear deservedly dull. Voices after midnight. The second disturbance chose a more delicate hour. It occurred at 20 minutes past midnight, when Great Minden lay in that careful sleep which pretended nothing would happen and therefore noticed everything. Curtains were partially open with moral discretion. Dogs breathed in the tired rhythm of things that had barked at nothing for years. The church clock, which had considered stopping for philosophical reasons, continued out of habit. At the telephone exchange, Miss Pike had not slept. She had not slept the night before, nor the one before that, but not from agitation. She simply found that sleep had lost its place in the order of things. She lay in bed with the sensation that something was being done correctly and therefore not being seen. At the precise moment that a distant train moved past the cutting beyond the town, the telephone in the exchange rang. This was unusual, for it should not have been able to do so without assistance. The bell trembled. It did not ring with demand, but with apology. Miss Pike sat up in her bed. It rang again. In her small parlour, Mrs. Joss also heard a telephone which did not technically exist. It lay on a side table for emergencies and had not been connected since the coronation. It gave a faint click inside its body, like a thought. She did not pick it up. At the railway buffet, the night porter heard a receiver slide from its hook, although no receiver was present. The wires, it seemed, had decided to remember their purpose, but not their discipline. At the exchange, no one was there to answer. And this, quietly, was the second event. By morning, the town had learned of it in the way towns learn, not through fact, but through the expression of faces. Those who had not slept felt privileged. Those who had slept felt cheated. "They rang," said Mrs. Claythorpe, "in the middle of the night." "Who?" asked Mrs. Potts. "No one," said Mrs. Claythorpe. "That's the point." Inspector Purbright stood at the exchange just after 8. The lamps were on, subdued but obedient. Miss Pike was already there, her hands resting as if they had been awake for hours. "Did it ring?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Did you hear it?" "No," she said. "I was too far away." This was honest. "There was no caller." "There could not have been," she said. He nodded and walked to the switchboard. One of the cords was warm, not visibly so. It merely gave that faint impression of having remembered itself in the night. He touched the back of his fingers to it. It was not electrical warmth. It was friction. Someone had handled it, gently, reverently, and more recently than the town would like. In the cupboard behind the board he found the true disruption, a small stack of folded paper, properly aligned, neatly formed, placed rather than dropped. The top one bore the same controlled hand as the black card. "You may ask now." He closed the cupboard without showing it to Miss Pike. This was not yet a communal object. At the police station, Sergeant Bligh was invigorated. "Now we've got him," he said. "He's been playing with the lines." "Who?" asked Purbright. "That Nim boy. Who else?" Purbright folded his thought. He asked to see Trevor. Trevor had the look of a person who had been awake for reasons not his own. "Did you make the phones ring last night?" he asked. "No, sir." "Did you try to?" "No, sir." "Did you go near the exchange?" "No, sir." "Did you touch a wire?" Trevor considered. "I changed a bulb in my room," he said. "It kept flickering." Purbright believed him. Outside the town hall, word of the night ringings had grown. "They're testing us," said a man who had never been tested. "It's foreign," said a woman who imported tea. "It's spiritual," said a man who owed the vicar money. More usefully, Miss Bonham from the charity shop passed by quietly. "They've been calling late from the council offices," she said, to no one in particular, and to Purbright. He went back. The cupboard behind the switchboard was exactly as he had left it, except the paper was gone, not removed carelessly, not taken in haste, simply returned to whatever pocket of the world it preferred. "Did you come in early?" he asked Miss Pike. "No," she said. "Did Mrs. Joss?" "She said she would stop by." "Did she?" "She looked in at the door." "Did she come in?" "I don't think so." But she had stood close enough to breathe on the handle. At midday, Mrs. Joss arrived with a composed face. "You look tired, Inspector," she said. "Oh," he replied, "I have been kept awake by silence." "How odd." He watched her hands. They were a little cleaner than usual, as if they had been washed of paper dust. That afternoon, the wires behaved normally, the lamps held steady, the exchange returned to its self-respect. Those who had heard nothing at night tried harder to believe they had. But the second incident had done its work. It had made the first assumption wobble, not collapse, just enough to let in doubt. By evening, the black card and the blank envelope lay once more on Purbright's desk. He did not look at them. He looked at the idea. Someone had moved from warning to invitation, from silence to controlled sound. Whoever it was no longer wished to hide the existence of listening. They wished instead to be asked, and that, he thought, was much more dangerous. Outside his window, a telephone in a darkened house gave a soft, meaningless click. Not a call, not a voice, just a reminder. The inspector thinks about decency. Morning came to Great Minden in the manner of a compromise. It was no longer confident, but it had not entirely lost heart. The exchange lamps glowed without protest, though they did so as one might smile at a neighbour whose habits had become questionable. The wires carried voices, but with the discretion of people who had learned that listening was no longer innocent. Inspector Purbright walked as he had always walked, which is to say, without the appearance of reaching conclusions. Yet his mind moved with the slow, well-bred habits of something that had been trained not to gallop. He thought about decency. Most men thought of decency as the absence of crime. Purbright thought of it as the presence of careful habits. He had never met a truly dangerous criminal who was not, in some way, wildly indecent. The clever ones, the quiet ones, were almost always tidy. He paused outside the vicarage, where the roses had been trained to behave in fixed directions. The Reverend Slade stood trimming them with unnecessary concentration. "Morning, Inspector," the vicar said. "Morning." "Unsettling business," said the vicar. "Unsettling minds," Purbright replied. "Well, of course," said the vicar, vaguely relieved. He continued towards the lawn outside the council offices. A litter bin had been repainted the previous evening, badly. This interested him. There were no footprints. There was, however, a faint smear of paint on the iron rail. Someone had leaned there. Someone who did not wish to be noticed. In a small, neat house behind the shops, Mrs. Joss poured tea for herself with a steadiness that bordered on triumph. She had slept poorly, which she resented in herself more than in anyone else. She had dreamed of drawers that would not close, and envelopes that would not remain empty. She poured a second cup and did not drink either. At the exchange, Miss Pike had returned entirely to routine, which now required a little more thought than usual. She had wiped the back of the cupboard. She had aligned the forms 3 times. She had not opened the drawer that held nothing. Mrs. Claythorpe, wiping a counter, told Mrs. Potts that they were all fools at the station. Mrs. Potts replied that it was always the quiet ones. They agreed that matters should have been simpler. Purbright did not go to the station. He went instead to the little footpath by the railway cutting, where the wind had a habit of telling the truth without meaning to. He stood a while and watched a piece of newspaper drift against a hedge and then become stuck. It resisted, then surrendered. It struck him that the business of listening had become fashionable. He thought of the card, he thought of the cupboard, he thought of the clean hands. People did not steal to hear secrets, he reflected, unless they feared being heard themselves. This was not about curiosity. It was about control, about knowing what was said while appearing not to listen at all. He returned to the exchange in the late afternoon. Miss Pike was alone. "Do you feel watched?" he asked. She considered. "I feel," she said slowly, "that things are done twice." "That is very perceptive." "The door," she added. "The one at the back. It feels—" "Corrected." He nodded. He did not open it. He asked instead, "Do people send letters that they do not want sent?" She looked offended. "People send letters because they wish them to arrive," she said. "And if they did not wish them to arrive, then they would not send them. And if they wished them not to arrive, but wished the act of sending to exist—" She was silent. "That," she said, very quietly, "would be unkind." At 5:30 he walked past the police station without entering. Sergeant Bligh watched from a window and felt faintly rebuked by the sight of his superior behaving like a man not in need of help. In a back room of the council offices, where paint still smelled faintly damp, Mrs. Joss opened a drawer she did not use very often. Inside lay neat parcels of things which required very little space and very much imagination. She touched one lightly and closed the drawer again. She felt, oddly, calmer. By evening, a quiet had settled that was not sleep. Purbright sat at his desk and did not look at the card or the envelope. He thought instead of keys, not of metal, but of manners. People, he thought, gave themselves away not by what they took, but by what they tidied, by what they adjusted when no one had asked them to, by the undue respect paid to locks which had never been forced. He thought of Mrs. Joss's hands, of the smeared paint, of the back door, of a blank envelope that remembered being full. He knew now that the motive would not be grand. It would be small, petty, respectable. It would involve the dignity of people who had sent letters they should not have sent, and the fear of people who had been overheard when they had said things that were not for minutes. The game, he saw, was being played by someone who had been useful all their lives, and did not intend to stop being so simply because manners had changed. He leaned back and closed his eyes. He could feel the shape of it, but not yet the edge. Outside, a telephone rang in a house where no one answered it. Not because they were asleep, but because they were listening. And that, he thought, was the most indecent thing of all. A most polite disturbance. Inspector Purbright decided on the morning of the 9th day that it was time to be helpful. This was not a decision he took lightly. Helpfulness in police work had a habit of alarming innocent people and soothing guilty ones. It was to be undertaken with the delicacy of moving ornaments in someone else's drawing room. He began by appearing unconcerned. He walked through Great Minden as if the matter had resolved itself, tipping his hat with the pleasantness of a man released from responsibility. The shops greeted him with relief. Mrs. Claythorpe smiled, as if she had personally secured order through butter rationing and prayer. Sergeant Bligh, observing from the station window, experienced a faint and undeserved sense of triumph. By mid-morning, word had moved. "Seems it was nothing after all," said Mrs. Potts, who felt faintly cheated. "Shame," said Mrs. Claythorpe. "It was quite interesting." At the exchange, Miss Pike found him unexpectedly light-hearted. "I thought I should see how everything was functioning now that things appear quieter," he said. "They are quieter," she said, and did not like the sound of it. Mrs. Joss arrived 5 minutes later, grazing the door with the careful entitlement of a person who knew which walls belonged to her. She had brought a small basket of biscuits that no one requested. "Good morning, Inspector," she said. "Ah, Mrs. Joss," he replied. "Just the person I had hoped not to disturb." She brightened. "I wondered," he went on, "whether you might help me with a small concern of procedure." "I can't imagine why not." "It concerns keys," he said mildly. Her fingers tightened very briefly. "Keys are straightforward things," she said. "That is my worry," he said. "They appear to be too straightforward." She laughed in the correct place. Later that day, he arranged a meeting. Not an official one, an informal one. He asked the town clerk, the vicar, Mrs. Joss, and Sergeant Bligh to come to the exchange for a discussion about communication security, which was a phrase that sounded useful, while meaning very little. Mrs. Joss dressed carefully. The vicar arrived with a notebook he did not intend to use. The clerk brought a pen with excellent manners. Bligh brought confidence. Miss Pike stood quietly in the background, polishing a surface that did not require polishing. Purbright began by talking about nothing. He spoke of post office procedures, of the dignity of public systems, of how important it was that respectable towns should not be led into unfounded excitement by stray occurrences of paper. Mrs. Joss nodded too often. "Now," he said lightly, "I should like to demonstrate how dangerous it can be when people attempt to improve systems that were not designed for improvement." He walked to the cupboard behind the switchboard. He opened it. It was empty. This was expected. "It is quite possible," he said, as though idly, "for someone with access to keys, municipal keys, for example, to practice techniques of listening which would not technically exist." He did not look at her. He watched her reflection in the polished brass. Her face did not move. Her hand did. It tightened on the handle of her bag, where something small and folded made a very slight sound. He continued, "It might be done not out of malice, but out of what I might call civic anxiety, a desire to know which conversations should not be happening." The vicar shifted. The clerk blinked. Bligh leaned forward, as if this were a lecture. "And it might be," Purbright said, still addressing a spot on the wall, "that such a person would also remove letters, not to send them, but to ensure that their absence protected certain reputations." Silence took on a new quality. Mrs. Joss's foot moved. They all heard it. "Of course," Purbright added softly, "if such a person believed that their actions might be misunderstood, they might create a small disturbance. A card, perhaps, a ringing line, a gentle warning, an invitation to stop asking questions." Mrs. Joss dropped her bag, not dramatically, respectably, quietly. Out of it slipped the black card. No one spoke. Bligh half rose. Purbright lifted a hand. "Please," he said, "there is no need for clumsiness." Mrs. Joss looked at the card on the floor. For the first time, she did not attempt to retrieve it. "I only wanted to keep things decent," she said. He inclined his head. "I believe you," he said. The meeting ended with astonishing politeness. No one raised a voice. No one asked questions. The vicar adjusted his collar. The clerk closed his pen. Bligh felt faintly cheated. Outside, Great Minden resumed breathing. Mrs. Claythorpe was told only that it was settled. Mrs. Potts was told only that it was delicate. Both were disappointed. Purbright walked alone as the light thinned. He knew he had reached the edge of the matter. He had unsettled what needed unsettling. The truth had shifted its weight. It would now fall where it belonged. But he had not yet spoken it aloud. He kept that for the proper place, the proper hour. At his desk that evening, he placed the black card and the blank envelope side by side again. For the first time they seemed honest. And in the quiet of the town, a woman who had spent her life closing doors softly sat in a parlor with no lights on, and realized that the most decent things she had ever done were about to become the most indecent things she had ever admitted. Outside her window, the telephone lines rested. They had heard enough. No need for embarrassment. The morning arrived with the sort of quiet that suggested it had been asked to behave. Rain had fallen in the night, not heavily enough to cleanse anything, but sufficiently to dim the dust of recent days. The pavements of Great Minden shone with a new, temporary honesty. Garden gates, never quite square, admitted defeat and leaned a little less stubbornly than usual. Inspector Purbright chose the council chamber for what was to follow, not because it was grand, but because it was proper. The room had heard statements before, it understood speech. The long table, polished by years of careful elbows, had been prepared to absorb delicate truths without complaint. Mrs. Joss arrived precisely on time. She wore a coat that suggested respectability without insisting upon it. Her gloves were clean. This, he noticed, was no longer an anxiety but a habit. She took the chair he indicated with the modest dignity of someone prepared for conversation, not disgrace. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he replied. Miss Pike was present at his request. She sat quietly, hands folded, her back unusually straight. She did not look at Mrs. Joss. She did not need to. Sergeant Bligh waited outside the door. where the presence of important moments unnerved him slightly. Purbright began, as he always did, with kindness. "There is no need for embarrassment," he said. "I am not embarrassed," Mrs. Joss replied at once, which was not entirely true and not entirely false. "I have not asked you here to accuse you," he continued. "I have asked you here to allow things to be said in the right room." She nodded. There was a silence. It was a good one. "You began," said Purbright gently, "some years ago, with a reasonable interest in what passed through the town." "I was protecting people," she said. "I believe you were," he said. He folded his hands. "You came to feel that certain communications were unkind. Letters that should not have been written. Conversations that should not have been held so close to wires." She looked at the window, where the rain moved politely downwards. "I never meant for it to become what it did," she said. "No," he said. "It rarely does." He spoke now as though laying out china on a table. "You had access to keys, that was official. You had access to drawers, that was unremarked. You removed letters sometimes, not for use, not for profit, but to reduce their harm." "It was better that way," she whispered. "Better," he agreed. "For many people." Miss Pike's fingers tightened once. Purbright continued. "When you began to worry that someone might notice the absence of things, you decided to create a different sort of absence, something that could be talked about. A disturbance. A card." Mrs. Joss closed her eyes briefly. "I thought it would end it," she said. "I thought if they were frightened enough to stop asking questions, it would all become quiet again. And then," he went on softly, "you realized that silence is noticed more than noise." She nodded. "So you made a noise in the night?" Miss Pike breathed in sharply but said nothing. "You rang lines that were not meant to ring. You handled cords. You placed folded paper where it might be found and then taken away again." "I never hurt anyone," Mrs. Joss said. "No," Purbright said. "You spared them." A long while passed. "You were careful," he said. "Always careful. You wiped shelves. You cleaned locks. You tidied steps. You left signs only when you meant them to be seen." "I didn't want it to look like chaos," she said. "I hate chaos." He looked at her now. "And when you realized that someone, myself, was beginning to see the shape of things, you invited the question you asked us to ask." She gave a faint, humorless sound. "I was tired," she said, "tired of watching properly." There was no melodrama in it. There was no collapse. Only the small, weary admission of someone who had spent too long straightening what did not belong to her. Miss Pike looked at Purbright. "She took letters," she said quietly, not accusing. "She returned kindness," he said quietly back. She accepted this and said no more. "The boy?" Mrs. Joss asked. "Is innocent," Purbright said. She nodded, absorbing this without relief. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," he said, "we do not destroy you for having been decent in the wrong direction." She waited. "You will stop," he said. "I will," she said. "There will be no charge," he said. "No report, no satisfaction for those who enjoy such things." "You are very kind," she said. "I am very tired," he corrected gently. When it was over, she stood. She paused. "I was very proud of Great Minden," she said. "It remains deserving of that," Purbright said. Outside, Sergeant Bligh tried to look as though he had been elsewhere. "Anything, sir?" he asked. "Nothing to trouble you," Purbright said. Bligh looked faintly cheated. By noon, the town felt a peculiar settling. No announcement was made, no story given. This disappointed several people and relieved none openly. Mrs. Claythorpe wrapped parcels with no news. Mrs. Potts sensed closure and mistrusted it. The telephones rang with innocent enthusiasm. The wires behaved. Miss Pike returned to her desk and found that, for the first time in days, the drawers felt as they should feel. Purbright returned to his own room. He placed the card and the envelope into a drawer of his own, which he then locked. He did not like loose ends lying about. He wrote one brief note on his pad. Matter concluded. Decency misplaced, not lost. That afternoon, rain began again. Not to wash, not to warn, just to exist. And Great Minden, which had tasted the thin edge of disorder and found it uninteresting, began once more to speak only of weather, prices, and the ordinary dangers of politeness. Nothing outwardly had been revealed. Everything inwardly had been understood. And only one chapter remained before silence could be properly restored. Nothing further is required. The last day did not arrive with ceremony. It slipped into Great Minden as quietly as a familiar coat being lifted from a hook, worn without comment, and settled into with relief. The rain ceased without announcing that it had ever begun. The sky regained its pale, responsible tone, and the town resumed its preferred occupation of being untroubled. At the telephone exchange, the lamps shone steadily. Miss Pike had polished the board to a condition which suggested forgiveness. The wires moved voices from place to place without embellishment. Bells rang when they were meant to. Receivers rested when they were not. No one folded anything. No one unfolded anything. The air lost its habit of hovering. Mrs. Joss remained indoors. Her curtains were drawn with correct modesty. Her kettle boiled twice and was forgotten. She sat in the chair nearest the window and considered how quiet a house could become when one had spent so long listening through the walls of other people's lives. She did not feel crushed. She felt released. It disturbed her slightly. Miss Pike did not visit her. This pleased both of them. Sergeant Bligh reported for duty with a brightness that had nowhere to go. He sharpened his pencil twice and arranged papers that did not require arranging. He sensed dimly that an excitement had passed him by, and that he had been expected to enjoy it. Inspector Purbright watched him from the doorway. "You look idle," said Bligh. "I am being thorough," said Purbright. At the market, Mrs. Claythorpe complained gently that there were no decent stories lately. Mrs. Potts agreed, and added that it was always the quiet ones, anyway, which in the circumstances resolved nothing and satisfied everyone. The vicar trimmed the roses again. Councillor Harrowby purchased humbugs of improved flavour and felt that the town had returned to its proper sweetness. In the exchange, Miss Pike opened the drawer. It contained nothing uninvited. She closed it with gratitude. Inspector Purbright walked in. "Everything behaving?" he asked. "As it should," she said. They stood without speaking for a time. "I liked it better when things were orderly," she added. "So did I," he said. "Do you think it will happen again?" she asked. He considered. "I think people will always try to improve silence," he said. "That is a pity." "Yes." He thanked her and left. That afternoon he returned the spare key to the emergency kiosk to its correct hook. He did not test the lock. He trusted it. Trust, he felt, should be exercised when possible, even if not deserved. He walked past Mrs. Joss's house. The curtains moved. They did not open. He did not stop. In his own room, he opened the drawer which now contained the card and the blank envelope. They lay with less arrogance than before. He looked at them once more. The card had lost something. Its blackness was ordinary. Its words had become tired. The blank envelope had accepted itself. He turned them face down. He shut the drawer. He wrote a final line. "Nothing further is required." Outside, the telephone lines sang their thin, respectful song. Voices passed, ordinary and unremarkable. Threats were not made. Confessions were not volunteered. Lives resumed their narrow, careful paths. In a parlour on the edge of town, Mrs. Joss opened a drawer she had opened for years. It was empty now. It looked, she thought, better that way. She touched the wood once, as one might touch a table that had seen too many meals. She folded her hands. She did not plan. She did not listen. She simply sat. At the exchange, Miss Pike placed the clock back to its proper time. She had grown accustomed to its speed. She turned it one small notch and felt that justice had been done. The sun reached the rooftops and paused, as if uncertain whether anything remained to be seen. Nothing did. Inspector Purbright placed his pen in its rack and allowed the fire to burn lower. He did not feel victorious. He did not feel disappointed. He felt that a thing had been understood well enough to be left alone. He lifted the receiver. He heard only the honest hum of a system at peace. He replaced it. He folded his hands. Outside, the town breathed in the slow, decent rhythm of people who had been near embarrassment and had stepped back in time. The streets accepted footfalls without comment. Doors closed quietly, as doors should. And in that careful quiet, where nothing important happened and nothing improper needed to be said, Great Minden returned to what it had always been. A town that preferred its mysteries folded, its scandals buried, and its decency, however misplaced, firmly intact.